my area as a theologian is Catholic social teaching. And Catholic social teaching, for those who don't have much of a background in, what is that phrase and what does it mean, is really the way in which that the official church, so the Pope and bishops, have engaged in responding to what ails the modern world. In 1891, Catholic social teaching, as we now know it, modern Catholic social teaching, begins during the Industrial Revolution, at a point in which the very way that human beings interacted with the economy and interacted with their job, the way we worked, fundamentally changed and began to shift. One thing I always like to note whenever I do talks like this about the beginnings of Catholic social teaching, why I talk about 1891, because for us here in America, the Catholic social teaching can often seem kind of remote and focused on what is coming out of Rome and can kind of feel far away sometimes. And so one thing that I like to share with my students and with parishes is that at the very beginning of Catholic social teaching, one of the influences that gave us Rerum Novarum was that the Bishop of Baltimore, along with bishops in Germany, were writing to Rome asking for pastoral guidance on how to best serve the people who at that time were immigrants working in factories being exploited. And so at that very beginning, part of the story that helps start what we know as modern Catholic social teaching actually did involve input and the experience of what was happening in the United States, not just what was happening over in Italy and over in Europe. Encyclicals as a genre, it's really just a fancy word for a letter that circulates. So we make a big deal about these big, long documents that the popes release in response to things going on in the world. But really the very word for it is simply a letter that circulates. Back in originally, you would denote how important that letter was by the weight of the parchment that they would use in order to disseminate the letter. Encyclicals being on the heavier parchment. And so in terms of the things that the Pope can say, an encyclical is one of the strongest, one of the heaviest weighted papers that he can circulate. And Fratelli Tutti then, it is a bit of an occasion, right? So Pope Francis releasing an encyclical, if you're in my line of work, it always seems a bit overwhelming. But some things to kind of see what's going on here. And this particular encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, it was a bit controversial before it even came out. The very choice of the phrase Fratelli Tutti, which literally is brothers all, referencing back to St. Francis of Assisi, stirred controversy. And while I'm not speaking today about the question, our next session will have more to do with politics and society and the inclusion or not of women. This is something that was starting to be talked about. What is it that he had in mind before it came out? And so in many ways, people formed opinions about Fratelli Tutti before it was even released. And when they look at it, and then you look at it, it seems like everything is here. It itself is a bit of an overwhelming encyclical that many commentators have said, it doesn't really have a core. It just goes from idea to theme to theme to theme. And stepping back, I want to say tonight that this does have a core. And that core is that in response to what is a pretty bleak situation of the world a year into a pandemic, that what Francis is actually doing by centering the parable of the Good Samaritan is inviting us into a message of hope. I also want to urge that anybody who isn't very familiar with Catholic social teaching, encyclicals aren't usually the best place to start, but I will say that there is a really good place to start if, you know, at the end of tonight, you think, I'd like to know a little bit more about solidarity or the common good and what's really going on. Pope Francis did a series of COVID-themed homilies, his Wednesday messages, this summer that got nicknamed the COVID catechesis. And I think the Holy Father intentionally framed and timed those catechetical messages as preparation for this encyclical. And in particular, those messages place the virtue of hope as the important companion to much of Catholic social teaching, to the principle of solidarity and the principle of subsidiarity, and the way we think about how we distribute goods in our global world. But what we're doing here tonight is looking specifically at Fratelli Tutti. And he begins by asking us to dream with him. Let us dream, he says, as a single human family, as fellow travelers, each of us bringing the richness of his or her beliefs and convictions, each with his or her own voice, brothers and sisters all. And so in my time with you tonight, what I'm hoping we can do and what I'm hoping I can help is in breaking open a little bit what Francis is inviting us to think about and what invitation to discipleship might mean this Lent. For Francis, dreaming about a world of solidarity and peace always begins with reflection on the gospel. He clearly has his favorite scripture passages. And you'll notice if you see or hear a lot of his homilies or his documents, the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we're focusing on tonight, shows up a lot. So does Cain and Abel, the Beatitudes, and other passages like that. And if we think for ourselves, we all have our favorites. We all have passages from scripture that for us end up being the core, or how we see the core of how we understand discipleship and what discipleship means in our lives. For me, I have a Post-it note that's right here above the computer. That's Micah 6:8. What is it that the Lord requires? Only this: to live justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. For me, that's the scripture passage that I latch onto and see as what discipleship means for me. I want to propose that the key to envisioning the world that Francis is asking us to dream is possible is that the theological key Fratelli Tutti gives us is a vision of discipleship that is rooted in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Pope Francis emphasizes throughout his time as Pope, this papacy has emphasized what he calls a culture of indifference and a globalization of indifference. He sometimes talks about the throwaway culture, the fact of a growing indifference to God, to neighbor, and to the rest of creation. And part of what that motto of eyes open, always have your eyes open to see, part of what's so beautiful about that is I think it captures part of what Francis is inviting us into, which is this: to recognize that in our world, the problem isn't just who's being oppressed or exploited. And this he does in Evangelii Gaudium. He says that oftentimes we have something even greater in front of us, which is it's as if some people just aren't even there. It's as if they're not part of the society at all, as if they don't even exist. And what I think holds Fratelli Tutti together is that Francis's answer here to where do we start as people of faith to build a different society where everyone is included, is he proposes the parable of the Good Samaritan. Those of us who do Catholic social teaching and social ethics, we tend to go to Matthew 25. We talk a lot about whatsoever you did for the least, an emphasis on the parable of the Last Judgment in Matthew. And so it was interesting when I first read Fratelli Tutti that's he references it, but that's not what Francis puts at the center. He puts at the center the parable of the Good Samaritan. A stranger on our road is how he titles the chapter. So he places all of us on the road to Jericho and invites believers in particular to engage in a deep personal and social reflection on who is our neighbor. It's an uncompromising parable. There's an America piece from a couple of years ago by Dr. Cecilia Gonzalez Andrio at Loyola Marymount University on the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's entitled, Who is Our Neighbor? And at the heart of her argument is reflecting on why it seems that we always seem surprised by the answer. Right, that the parable in Luke asks us, and who is my neighbor? And we seem surprised at how encompassing the answer is. She also very helpfully points out that some of what gets in the way of our imagination on who is my neighbor is the fact that there is only one word for neighbor in English. And that she has a beautiful reflection on how there are 3 different words that apply in this context that help us see more robustly in Spanish. And my students love this essay because they too note that there always seems to be, and this is why I think Francis is highlighting this parable, we know the story, we know how it ends, and yet in practice we seem to be surprised at the answer. Who is my neighbor? As I reflect on what Pope Francis has to say in Fratelli Tutti and my own understanding of the parable of the Good Samaritan, I find myself going back to some people that Francis is we know is influenced by, and one that maybe he is, I don't know. The reflections by Martin Luther King Jr., by Gustavo Gutierrez, and then by a Jewish New Testament scholar, Amy Jill Levine, to help us understand the radical call of discipleship contained in Luke's parable. And in Fratelli Tutti, Francis notes that he was, in fact, notes King as an influence. In his final speech before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. examined the parable of the Good Samaritan in great detail. And he had more compassion for the priest and the Levite than I usually can muster myself.
I can't.
Although I do want to note that we're often I read examples and expositions on the parable of the Good Samaritan that offer religious reasons for why the priest and the Levite keep walking and they don't stop. And Jewish scholars like Levine are quick to point out that blaming their indifference on any religious ritual reason within Judaism at the time is unfounded. They should stop and they don't. It is that simple. But there are people who should know better, who should know to stop, and they don't. They're believers. They're the faithful who don't stop. And King has more compassion for them than I myself often have. He proposes that maybe they were afraid. That the root of the problem isn't that they didn't care, but that they were more concerned with themselves. They asked themselves, what will happen to me if I stop to help this man? King notes. But the Samaritan flips the question and instead asks, what will happen to the wounded man if I do not stop? Francis indicates that he was influenced by this exegesis of the Good Samaritan as a practicing of radical unselfishness, of radical compassion. And for both of them, the parable is a strong call to self-examination. Francis notes, and you see the quote there in front of you, that we need to constantly acknowledge that we are constantly tempted to ignore others, especially the weak. We have become accustomed to looking the other way, passing by, ignoring situations until they affect us directly. And that's from Fratelli Tutti 64 and 65. He goes on towards the end and concludes the end of the parable section saying, I should no longer say that I have neighbors to help, but that I must myself be neighbors to others, in paragraph 81. What does it mean to make a shift where I acknowledge in self-reflection the temptation to keep walking, and then get to a place where I not only see I not only see the person on the side of the road, but that I stop, that I be neighbor to others. This phrasing of, but I must myself be neighbor to others, reminds me of, and this, I was not present for said homily, I wish I was, but a news report of a homily that Gustavo Gutierrez gave in Rome about 6 years ago, in which he noted that he argued that naturally we have no neighbors. We become neighbor when we leave our path and approach the other. That is behind what Francis is calling us to do, who we're being called to be. Not just that I must myself be neighbor to others, but I must actively become neighbor. For Francis, this is a daily decision. Each day, he says in Fratelli Tutti, we have to decide whether to be good Samaritans or indifferent bystanders. This then provides the foundation for a greater sense of our moral obligations within local, national, regional, and even for Catholic social teaching, global communities. And this is particularly acute in a full year now into a global pandemic, in which we're aware, maybe more than we were before, of the fact that we must choose to be neighbor to those around us, but also that even if we aren't making that choice, we're still affected, whether we want to be or not. We cannot insulate ourselves. The interdependence is painfully obvious to us. To try and complicate this even further, Amy Jill Levine, who I said is a Jewish New Testament scholar, she's at Vanderbilt. She argues that if you were the first century Jewish audience hearing this, that Christians often talk about how the Samaritans were outcasts. And I even have a version of a modern retelling of the parable that I use with my students, right? Who is it that we don't acknowledge as part of our community, that we don't want to see as part of our community? And then we can start to understand who the Samaritans were as they functioned in the story. But Levine says that in reality, the parable is much more radical than just outcasts are the ones who get it. But that the Samaritans weren't outcasts to the first century audience, they were the enemy. That the person who saves you, notes Levine, may be your enemy. And then she follows up, noting that the structure of the parable leads the reader to realize that they aren't the Samaritans, but the wounded man in the ditch. saved by their enemy. Thus, the parable to Jesus's first century audience, like the framing of Fratelli Tutti itself, pushes us to see the face of the enemy, as well as the excluded, the outcast, are also in the image of God. And so we go back to Fratelli Tutti, where Francis says, let us look to the example of the Good Samaritan. Jesus's parable summons us to rediscover our vocation as citizens of our respective nations and of the entire world, builders of a new social bond. This summons is ever new, yet grounded in a fundamental law of our being. We are called to direct society to the pursuit of the common good. And with this purpose in mind, to persevere in consolidating its political and social order, its human goals. By his actions, the Good Samaritan showed that the existence of each and every individual is deeply tied to that of others. Life is not simply time that passes. Life is a time for interactions. Fratelli Tutti 66. And so as you sit with and reflect on Fratelli Tutti this Lent, I want to propose to you that this parable of the Good Samaritan is the theological core. It's the invitation to think about our own discipleship in a deeper way. And it's deeply Ignatian, right? He's the Jesuit Pope. It's deeply Ignatian in its structure, inviting us as persons and communities to discern who we are becoming and discern, are we becoming neighbor to those around us or not? Are we remaining indifferent? I want to share with you one particular story of a place that is really special to me in Nairobi, Kenya, a place where there was lots of people look away, and yet the missionary sisters of the precious blood did not. I want to share with you a little bit about the Imani Primary School in Ruwerta, Nairobi. This school has much to teach us about what it means to become neighbor to those living on the margins, otherwise ignored or invisible, or considered a nuisance. This primary school, I mentioned, is run by the missionary sisters of the precious blood, and it provides rehabilitation and primary education for street children from the nearby Kawangware slum. In the late 1980s, hungry children were spontaneously arriving in their courtyard each day. In response, they built a small structure with a kitchen and began serving soup. Bit by bit, this evolved into religious instruction about God and Jesus while the children sat in the courtyard. It was clear these children had potential, but they were cut off from regular schools, had fallen behind, and did not see a future for themselves. They were invisible to most in society and often simply considered a nuisance to those who did notice them. But they weren't invisible to the sisters who set about opening a primary school. They set about taking a building that had been a school for the blind that was no longer needed and turning it into the Imani Primary School. Bit by bit, they moved from instruction in English, Swahili, and math to establishing a fully functioning primary school that in 2007 graduated its first class from grade 8, taking the national exam. I had the privilege of meeting one of those first graduates, a young man who after Imani went on to secondary school and then university, who had only just graduated with a degree in education in 2015. Today, it remains a fully operational school with social worker and dedicated rehabilitation classes. Students are placed by ability, and every effort is taken to allow them to complete primary school, take the national exam, and move on to secondary school, often with the school needing to provide what it is they need for school fees and uniforms for secondary school. This is sometimes a great challenge, as students may have been effectively out of school for many years when they come to Amani. Today, Amani's programs have developed beyond the school to a series of outreach programs to engage parents in workshops and meetings. Sister Ann Grace, the administrator, has expanded these programs to include a more formal program aimed at empowering mothers. These programs have been of varying successes, but the process has restored agency and dignity to the community. Their newest project, as of 2018, was a community garden, including chickens and other livestock, taking Laudato Si into account. And much that is grown is used in the school cafeteria to feed lunch to all the school children. The Precious Blood Sisters have taken seriously the commitment to compassion and the Good Samaritan. They focus their efforts on building a community that is full of dignity, that these children can become dignified agents of their own destiny, to reference what Pope Francis called for when he visited the United Nations. They did not simply feed hungry children, staying separate and protected. They entered into the children's reality, listening, questioning, and out of this reflection, a school was born. It's easy to see the overlap with the parable in which the Good Samaritan takes oil and wine and bandages the wounds and brings him to an inn where he gives money to make sure he's cared for and says he will stop to see on his way back. But the sisters never stopped listening and reading the signs of the times. And from listening to their students, greater outreach to the mothers and the rest of the community developed. This ongoing role and importance of Amani's mission is an ongoing effort to live out the parable of the Good Samaritan. For me, Amani is a community that is a beautiful example of building a culture of solidarity and compassion. And it is no accident that Amani is the Kiswahili word for peace. So I share with you a little bit about this school that I spent a lot of time visiting, actually not because of my field work, but because at the time, one of my colleagues here in Queens, who has since retired, was a missionary sister of the Precious Blood, who, when I got the chance to go to spend a semester in Nairobi, said, well, you have to go and visit my sisters. So the welcoming into the community for fellowship by my colleague's community, right, her global community of the sisters, connected me with these amazing children and this school that only can do that because they see it as a practice of discipleship. If it were just another government school, it would be for everybody in the area. But because they've set up this targeted mission, it allows them to focus on the children that otherwise fall through the cracks of the regular educational system. Compassion and care at Amani leads to a greater sense of justice and agency for these young people. I like to include music in when I teach or I give talks like this, because it can give us a moment to reflect and to think. As many of you will know, Catholic Relief Services is the U.S. international component of Caritas International, the overarching global Catholic efforts at development. And a number of years ago, they had a campaign that was One Human Family, Food for All. And a group of young people associated with Caritas Panama wrote and organized this song. The young woman named Marisol in the video, she's actually the author of the song. And so this song that was a collaboration of young adults across Central America and the US southern states was part of Caritas International's One Human Family, Food for All campaign. And so I pause now and I'll play the song. And then we have a good amount of time for us to reflect on any questions or thoughts or feedback, just where you're at and what you think about thinking about and centering the parable of the Good Samaritan this Lent, as I've proposed to you, Pope Francis is inviting us to do.
No so long time ago, there was a small town that harvests food where they received a meal. After being sure that people get what they need, they gather happy and joyful and humble in their acts, which is the sign of the presence of our living God. I'm done with this world full of greed and full of lies. We're just what is and what is not depend of a man. Where we are, the food that is enough to feed the world one and twice, and only as you get their meal, that's what it's like.
what I particularly like about that song is I find in particular the fact that it is entirely written and performed by young people who have made a decision to be neighbors to others and to see what otherwise we don't necessarily see, to resist the temptation to look the other way and keep walking. And so now we have a good amount of time. We're right on schedule. Where do you see a stranger on the road, the title Francis gives to the section on the parable of the Good Samaritan in Fratelli Tutti? Where do you see the parable as something that can help you this Lent? And where will or can we raise our voices this Lent so that we truly do become neighbor to one another and to those who are not able to be in communities like ours, not especially this pandemic, who don't have the access to the technology and the community that we do.